So our closing keynote is an information architect and strategic designer based in San Francisco Bay Area in California. In his consulting practice, he partners with product design and innovation leaders to create digital places that make people smarter. He has designed information environments for all types of organizations, ranging from developing world nonprofits to Fortune 500 corporations. He is a frequent speaker at global UX conferences. He is also the author of Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places, and co-author of Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. He has served the global UX community as president and director of the Information Architecture Institute and as thematic director of the first World IA Day. Besides his consulting practice, he is also an adjunct professor in the Interaction Design program at the California College of the Arts. Please join me in welcoming Jorge Arango.
Thank you, Leslie. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you all for being here. It's a privilege for me to be able to address a room full of professionals who are working to improve our civic environments. It's really an honor for me to be here. So thank you for having me. And I'm also grateful for this wonderful room we're in. We were talking about this yesterday. It's, as Leslie said, I speak often at conferences, and it's rare to have a room of this size that has natural light, yes. Right? And I'm feeling very grateful to be in this space with you. As Leslie mentioned, I am an independent information architect. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm also a teacher. I'm a professor at the California College of the Arts and an author. I was a co-author of this book, which you may have seen at some point. It's affectionately known as the Polar Bear Book, originally written by Lou Rosenfeld and Peter Morville, and I worked with them on the 4th edition. And I am also author of this book, which came out in the summer. So this is brand new. It's called Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places. So my background is in architecture, as in the design of buildings. And this book, even though my background is in architecture, I've been practicing what we call user experience design now for almost 25 years. So this book tries to take some of the lessons that I learned from architecture and use them to improve the way that experienced designers do their work, and in particular, how we create the digital places where so many of our interactions are happening these days. And that is what our time together today is going to focus on. And I feel obliged to make the disclaimer, because it's kind of early in the morning and you all have just had breakfast, that this is a somewhat philosophical talk. But I find that philosophy can be very useful if it helps us solve problems by reframing the way that we understand what we do. And I'm hoping that that's what we'll be doing here today. So let me start by telling you about a recent change in my professional life. Up until fairly recently, I was a partner in a design consultancy based in Oakland. And I left that company and went into business on my own. And as part of that change, I had to building. So this is the City Hall of San Leandro, California, the city where I live and where my business is based. And my house is actually very close to City Hall. I walked there when I visited, but I had never been there before. I was prompted to visit because of this professional change. I needed to get a business license that allowed me to run my business from my home. And I was told that I needed to go there. So I walked over, and City Hall is part of a beautiful complex of buildings in downtown San Leandro. It's not freestanding. You can't see it in the photo here, but to the left is police headquarters for the city. and there's a little plaza, and there's an office building, a government office building kind of in the back. And they all have a similar style. There's a coherence to this place where you can tell that there's a lot of care that's been placed into this kind of civic architecture, right? So I go to City Hall and I walk in the building, and I had never been there before, so I'm kind of a little lost, disoriented. But fortunately for me, there's a map on one of the walls. And I kind of go up to the map, and I knew that I was looking for a room, for a particular space in this building called the One-Stop Permit Center. I was told that that's where I needed to go to get my business license processed. And I had a bit of a hard time. You'll see that some of the color choices there are a little dodgy. The room I was looking for is actually one of the blue ones, and that kind of black text on blue doesn't read very clearly. But I found it eventually, right? And I kind of got my bearings in the space, and I said, it looks like it's down this hallway. So I made it down the hallway, and I eventually ended up in this space. And this is a long room with a series of stations, and I don't know if you can see you probably can't read from the back, but there are little signs hanging above the stations that say records and engineering and planning, right? And I had been told that I needed to go to the engineering station. Now this room is empty in this photograph, but the day I was there, it was bustling. There were people there asking for construction permits to make additions to their homes. There was one person consulting a microfiche, which I had not seen in a long time. There was a microfiche system in this space. And there were other people getting business licenses as well, so I had to wait. And eventually I made it to one of the stations. The person looked over my documents. I was then sent to another part of the building where I paid, and then I went on my way, right? So I'm telling you this story because for most of our recorded history, our transactions, our interactions with each other have happened in environments like this one, in physical environments. We have been working in buildings and towns for a long time, and we have developed ways of designing these things so that they serve our needs, and we have developed means for moving around these environments so that we can find our way to where we need to go to do the things we need to do. And we are currently in the process of moving very important parts of our social interactions from this type of environment to a new type of environment that we access kind of at will through these small glass rectangles that we carry around in our pockets and that we unfold on top of our laps and on coffee shop tables. And it's not just civic transactions that are moving from physical environments to information environments. We are increasingly doing our banking in information environments. We are consuming our arts and entertainment in information environments. We are doing our shopping in information environments. I don't know if you all have heard of this thing that's been called the Great Retail Apocalypse of 2017, where all these shopping malls are being abandoned because Amazon has taken over, right? We're increasingly learning in information environments through things like Udemy. Many people are finding their mates through information environments. This is something that traditionally our species has done in physical space, right? We are holding important parts of our civic discourse in information environments. And of course, more and more of us are working in information environments. So this image on the left here is a photograph of the great workroom in the Johnson Wax headquarters, a very famous building by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is one of the first open plan office spaces in the world. And it's been described by the architecture critic Paul Goldberger as having been designed to instill in the company's clerical workers a sense of community and nobility. These days, if we want to instill in our workers a sense of community, we think very carefully about how we structure our Slack channels. And unfortunately, we no longer strive for a sense of nobility. In any case, my main point here is that these information environments are taking over from physical environments for many of our most important social interactions. Like physical environments, information environments create contexts that affect how we think about the place we're in, and therefore how we behave. The problem is that we haven't been designing them as though they were places, as though they were contexts. If you listen to the way that my colleagues, my peers talk about the work that we do, you will hear us talk about designing products or services or tools or interactions or experiences. And all of these things are transactional and ephemeral. They are meant to be foreground, not background. And there are multiple problems with this. One problem is that if we think of the things that we're making as somehow ephemeral and kind of off the moment, we're not going to be building out the necessary infrastructure to last for the long term. So we end up not devoting the resources, in many cases, that we need to think about the longevity of these things. And I think that one result of this is that they're not serving us very well as places. We have seen a marked erosion in our ability to hold civic discourse over the past decade or so. And I think that it's due in no small part to the fact that we are moving these very important conversations to environments that were not designed to host them. In fact, they weren't even thought of as environments at all. Being based in the West Coast, I sense a great deal of anxiety about this situation. You may have seen it kind of play out in the news. And especially among my community of peers, I get a sense of like despair about what's going on. And rather than despair about it, I've been trying to encourage people to start thinking of themselves, people who do the sort of work that we do, to start thinking of ourselves more as architects that are responsible for designing and building and managing these environments where these all-important conversations are happening. In particular, there's this question that I've been asking myself that kind of drives my work, and it's also at the center of the book, which is how might we build information environments that better serve our needs as a society in the long term? How might we build information environments that better serve our needs as a society in the long term? And with my background in architecture, you won't be surprised to learn that I have ideas that come from that field, because architects have been designing environments for a long time, and they've developed ways of approaching these problems, right? And architecture is meant to last. It's not built for the moment. So I have three ideas that I bring from architecture to the design of things like websites and apps, and that I want to share with you today, which I think can help us do this, can help us design things that better serve our needs in the long term. The first of these ideas is the importance of structure and focusing on the structure of the things that we create. And by structure here, I don't mean the physical structure that holds the thing up, right? Like, so websites and apps are software. They don't have the same sort of structure that a building does. By structure, I mean the conceptual structures that define the place, the distinctions that we set up that make one part of the environment different from another, right? All environments have them. In the best situation, the parts are distinctly different. They're recognizably different from each other, but they are also coherent as a whole. There's a gestalt to them where they tie together, kind of like City Hall in San Leandro, where I could tell, like, these things are different, but they're also kind of part of the same. These conceptual structures are what make environments understandable, and they influence how we think about the environment and our role in it. What role am I expected to play in this environment? That's kind of dictated by these conceptual structures and these distinctions that we introduce. So consider this room that we're in right now, right? So this room has been structured in such a way that you are able to pay attention to what I'm saying. So I'm standing on this little platform that kind of raises me above you all, right? And you all are sitting there after having had your breakfast and are kind of paying attention in this direction. We have this large screen behind me, right? Like, all these things are drawing your attention towards me. That's a conceptual distinction that has been imposed on this physical environment to make it possible for us to have this conversation, right? This is not a two-way conversation. Like, I can see you nodding and I can see you following along, but I'm the one doing the talking, right? So this room is designed for you to pay attention to me. This room is one of many in this hotel, and they all serve different purposes, right? So if you're staying here, you have a different space in this hotel that serves that purpose, and it's structured for that particular use. Now, we need to be able to find our way through these environments. I had never been in this hotel before last night when I arrived, right? So I was a little kind of confused at first. I knew I was in the right place because you all had put up signs that said NAGW, right? And I was like, okay, I made it, I'm here. But now I got to get my bearings. So I looked for a little map, right? I was told by the reception that my room was upstairs, which I kind of guessed at, right? But I didn't know where this talk was going to be. I kind of walked around, but the environment is labeled, right? Like, we put names on the things. I had seen on the conference website that I would be speaking in a room called King's Garden 4 and 5, and I was like, oh, that's King's Garden, right? Like, so we label these things so that we can make our way around the environment. And by today, I have a pretty good conceptual model in my mind of how this physical environment is laid out, and I am now more competent than I was when I arrived, right? And we do this all the time, and we do it in physical environments, and we also do it in information environments like websites and apps. And it's important to note that these conceptual structures, these distinctions that we create between spaces, are not good just for navigating. They also create a context. So you all are in a conference-going mindset. You're not in your office, you're not in your home. When you're here, you think differently about your demeanor, your behavior, your way of interacting with other people. And that's partly due to the fact that you know how to use these environments. We do the same thing when we design a website or an app, right? So there's this exercise that I like to do, and I've done it with my students, where you go to a website and cover up the branding and see if you can get a sense for what that place is just from looking at things like navigation structures. I think that if you do that, you will find that you can get a lot of information just from looking at the labels, the way that that environment labels the different parts of the thing, right? So if you start reading links with names like banking and credit cards and investments and stuff like that, you start thinking, maybe this is a bank, right? And you bring expectations to that interaction because you know that banks in information environments usually have things like a login box that lets you access a different part of the environment if you're a customer, right? And much like we do with physical environments, we now have patterns of use for these things. And if you're going to design one of these things, you have to account for the fact that there is a history now of using them. And we adopt a particular mindset when we are told that we are in that kind of context. So these conceptual structures are very important for that reason. But there's another reason why they're important, especially if we're aiming for longevity. And it's that they tend to change more slowly than other parts of the environment. And this is something that I was aware of kind of intuitively through my work, but it only really became evident to me when I was working on the 4th edition of the Polar Bear book, Because one of my tasks in that project was updating the examples in the book. So the third edition had come out before the iPhone and before Facebook and all these things had come about. So, you know, there was a lot of work to do just visiting all the websites and stuff that had been used in the third edition as examples and updating them. And as I did that, it became clear to me that the visual presentation of these things, the aesthetics, had changed a lot in the decade that spanned the two books. You know, we had larger displays. We had smaller displays. We had greater color gamuts. We had good typography. We had higher bandwidth connections, so you could use big photographs, right? All in the span of this decade. So the websites looked very different. But when you looked at the navigation structures, you could recognize them. They were still very similar. And this, you know, if you've done work in this space for a long time, you may have seen this, that when we talk about redesigning these things, often we're talking about like making them look more modern, but big structural changes are more rare. And this is something that is also true in physical architecture. There is a very, are you all familiar with this diagram? Have you all seen it? This is a model called a pace layer model. And it was introduced by Stuart Brand in a fabulous book called How Buildings Learn, which is about how buildings stand the test of time. And this is a model that comes from architecture, but Brand kind of took it and ran from it. And what he says here is that buildings don't change all at the same rate. They're composed of things that change at different rates over time. And he listed them as 6 layers. They go from slowest at the bottom to fastest at the top. So if you think about this space that we're in now, if you wanted to make an intervention to this space, the most expensive thing you could do is mess around with the foundations and the ground that the building is built on, right? The second next most expensive is the physical structure that's holding the place up, right? Then the skin of the building, that you can change more easily. Still, you have to worry about the elements and stuff. The next up is what he called space plan. I think they intentionally chose all S's to make it more memorable. Space plan is kind of clunky. But what he means by space plan is the internal divisions. So this room that we're in now is an excellent example. I don't know if you can tell over there where the coffee station is. There are panels there that allow the hotel to close half of this room, right? So this room can change fairly easily through that. And you can make changes in your home, in the internal walls, as long as you're not, you know, punching through physical structure. And then the final layer, the one that changes the fastest in buildings, he called stuff. And that's furniture. You know, for example, like this room, like when we're done this morning, the hotel staff is probably going to come in here and, you know, take out these tables and reconfigure this room for the next conference. And it could be completely different, right? So that changes fairly painlessly. So Brand said, you know, this is how buildings change, and if you want to make an intervention, it's cheaper to do it in the upper layers. And the other point he made here is there's friction between them, right? Like where the layers meet, usually there's friction, and if you look at the history of buildings, you can see it in action. So, but this idea that things change, kind of, things are composed of layers that change at different speeds, is super useful. It has applications in many domains. And in fact, in a subsequent book called The Clock of the Long Now, Brand used the very same model to explain not how buildings change, but how civilizations change. Like really high level, right? Like he's saying, this is how our civilizations evolve. And it's the same idea. He's saying, you know, the layers at the bottom change more slowly. The layers at the top change more quickly. By nature, he means things like our biology, right? Like our biology changes over time, but it changes kind of relatively slowly, right? We evolve. Things like culture and governance and infrastructure, they change progressively faster. And ultimately, he has this layer he called fashion or art, where things change very quickly. If you think of like, you know, the idea of fashion, like you don't want to be caught dead, you know, with last year's fashions, or heaven forbid, like even older garb like I'm wearing, right? But he makes an interesting observation here, which is germane to our topic today, which is that the civilizations that are successful establish a healthy balance between the layers that change quickly and the layers that change slowly. Because, he says, the fast-changing layers are where civilizations experiment with new ideas. Think of art. Have you all visited the Warhol Museum here? Yeah, right? So a lot of crazy stuff there, right? And this was a period in the 1960s where there was a lot of ferment and a lot of experimentation happening, right? And some of those ideas were kind of of the moment and they look dated. But there are other ideas that we have adopted and kind of made part of our culture. And he talks about them kind of like making them their way down the layers. And he makes the point that if the fast-changing layers are where civilizations experiment with new ideas, the slower layers are where civilizations remember the ones that are worthwhile, right? So there's this idea of experimenting and then kind of adopting the good ones, right? And this is something that I think is very important for us to do in our work. So I've been working on a pace layer model for the sort of work that we do. And as with brands models, it goes from slower changing layers at the bottom to faster changing layers at the top. And I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail, but I'll just read them real quick. So purpose is why the thing exists. Like, why are we making this? What is it in service to ultimately, right? Strategy is how you're going to execute on that purpose, how it's going to be different from other things in the world that kind of have similar intent. Governance is the way that you're going to make that strategy have actual impact in the world. You have to organize teams. You have to deal with regulations. You have to obey the laws. You have to have mechanisms for getting money, for paying people. So you have to put in this machinery in place to allow this purpose to be achieved. Then come the two layers where people in our domain are usually involved in. Structure, which is the one I was talking about, I've been talking about, you know. And then what I call form, which is, you can think of it as user interface, right? The things that people actually interact with. And for folks who do what we do, we usually conflate form and structure and think about it as design. Like we're designing the app or the website or whatever. But as I've been pointing out, I think they are different. They move at different paces. And it's important to think about them separately for various reasons. One is the capabilities of our devices evolve more quickly than are the ways that we need to slice these things up, right? And another reason is that we are moving to a world, we have moved into a world in which people experience these environments through multiple form factors, right? So we have people accessing these things on our phones and on our websites. And I didn't show you, but the part of the San Leandro city website where I actually requested my business license, which is what drove me to the building, actually doesn't render well on phones. It's designed for desktops, right? But increasingly, more and more of our experiences are designed to work in both. So it's important to think about what they have in common, which is why I separate structure from form. And that is the first idea I wanted to get across, the importance of structure, right? So the second idea that I bring to you all from the world of architecture is that these structures don't stand on their own, right? Like for people to be able to experience them, they need to be executed as artifacts and things that are very complex and actually embody a set of systems, right? By system, I mean a collection of elements, a set of elements that are interrelated in specific ways that allow them to achieve a shared purpose. It's a pretty broad definition. But architects are trained to think this way. You know, when we went to architecture school is not about learning to make a building that looks good. Think about this room that we're in now, right? So for this space to be able to work as an environment, there's a lot of stuff going on here. There is a physical structure that is keeping the building above us from crushing us, okay? There is a sheathing system that keeps the elements at bay. There is an electrical system that is making possible for you to look at my slides and hear my voice. There's a heating and air conditioning system that is keeping the air relatively cool. There's a plumbing system that is bringing in fresh water and taking out dirty water, right? And all of these things need to work in perfect synchrony for this space to be functional. If this room was too hot or too cold, or there was no electricity, or like there's so many conditions under which this wouldn't work, but it works. It works because someone, most likely a group of people, have thought through how the different elements that compose it kind of mesh together to make it work. And we must start thinking systemically in our work as well. So the example I usually use to illustrate this in the design of information environments is the design of a ride-sharing app for your phone, something like Lyft or Uber, right? If you all use these things, you know, someone designed the app that you're interacting with. And if you're going to be successful at designing one of those things, you cannot focus just on the passenger app. You have to be cognizant of the fact that there is a complement to that passenger app, which is a driver app. Because ride-sharing apps such as these are marketplaces. There's a supply side and a demand side, and there's a system in the middle that kind of brings those together, right? And you need to understand what things are called in each side and make sure that they work well together. So this is a map of one of these ride-sharing apps, right? Like kind of illustrating at a high level what those different components are. And thinking systemically entails understanding what the parts are, the parts of the system, what role they play, how they relate with each other, what goal they're trying to achieve, right? And even if you're not the person who's designing the overall thing, it behooves you to understand where your part fits into the whole and what it needs to know of the other parts and what it needs to provide to the other parts for it to work. Now, it's also important to question where the boundaries of these systems lie, because increasingly, these things that we work on are not under the complete control of the organization that we're working for, right? So if you're designing a ride-sharing app, you're probably going to be using maps. And your organization is not going to be able to go out and map the entire world. You're going to be leveraging maps that were built by another organization. You're going to depend on the global positioning satellite system. And your organization is not going to build that. You're going to use the one that already exists. You're not going to build a cell network. You're not going to create the devices that people will use to access this thing. You're not going to build the payment mechanisms. Yet all of those things are integral to this experience, right? So you need to understand that even though the boundaries of the system that you're working on exceed the scope of your organization, the parts that are outside your control are essential for it to function. And we need to expand the boundaries of those systems as we think about them to consider the fact that the societies where we are launching these things into are an important part of that system as well. And we need to be careful to not compromise the integrity of those societies by the things that we release into them. So systems, that's the second idea that I bring from the world of architecture. The third and final idea is that these systems are never static. They're always changing and evolving. And those of us who design and build them need to vie to make them evolve in ways that don't compromise their integrity in the future, that ensure their survival in the long term. Again, this is something that architects have been doing for a long time. Architecture is meant to last. Like, I don't know when this building was designed, but it looks like it's been around for a while, right? Like, this is not something that was meant to be of the moment. And architects are increasingly thinking about how the things that they design can be made to last longer and be better participants in the broader systems that they participate in. So you'll know what a LEED certification is. Have you heard of this? So LEED certification is a way for people who build and operate buildings to ensure that their buildings are basically ecologically sound. And right here in Pittsburgh, we have a great example of a LEED certified building. So the PPG Paints Arena, where the Penguins hockey team plays, is the first major sports venue in the United States that's been certified LEED Gold. And they have amazing stats, like they conserve 40%, they use 40% less water than a regular arena, for example. And they use 31% less energy than a regular arena, right? And there are principles behind this, like that, and there are goals that these people strive for. And there's, in the architectural community, it's a badge of pride to say, my building is LEED certified. Like, I'm doing something responsible for the environment that I'm putting this into, right? So when we talk about sustainability, I usually focus on three pillars, or three main areas, right? There is the sustainability of the thing from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and from an ecological perspective. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about all three with the perspective of information environments, okay? So I think the economic pillar is perhaps the easiest to understand. It's the most common sense one. It's the idea that the thing that you're working on needs to have resources coming in to at least cover the cost of the resources that it's taken for it to exist, right? You need to bring in more money than you consume. If not, you're not going to be around for long, right? And this is something that I think is obvious in most domains. But in information environments, in particular, we've seen cases where we have launched these things that have had tremendous adoption in our societies, which frankly have no clear business model that is forward-facing. I think the Twitter is probably the prime example. I don't know if you all recall this, but Twitter tried to sell itself a few years ago, and it couldn't find buyers for various reasons. One of them is that its business model is really kind of not clear, right? And for the social impact that something like Twitter has, it doesn't make as much money as it probably should, right? So this idea of economic viability is very important if the thing that we're designing is going to last a long time. So that's kind of baseline, right? The second pillar, the social pillar, is also related to business model. And it has to do with the fact that I mentioned earlier, this idea that these things that we're making don't exist in isolation. They exist within societies. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that they're going to have an impact on society. And those of us who design, build, and manage them need to be wary that the thing that we're making doesn't harm the container, right? Like the body that's going to host it somehow. And unfortunately, we have moved very important social conversations, frankly, a lot of our civic discourse, to environments that are not designed to do that. They're actually designed to engage you and persuade you because they make their money through advertising, right? And the idea behind civic discourse is that we figure out ways of living together as neighbors, even if we disagree, because we have to share the same place. But this is a model that is kind of fundamentally designed to narrow us down into ever smaller demographics, to persuade us, to keep us engaged. These are not the things you want if you're going to have a civic conversation. So we have to think about our business models and how they impact the society that is hosting our thing. I believe that is less relevant to you all because you are working kind of directly in civic information environments. But this is something that folks in my part of the world, in the West Coast, are thinking a lot about because it's become kind of evident what the impact is of this, right? The third pillar is the trickiest and the one where I think we have the greatest responsibility, because you might say, well, business model is not something that's really up to me, right? I'm a designer or a webmaster working on this thing. But this is something that I think we do have a voice in. And you may be thinking, well, what does ecology have to do with this, right? Like the image that we have of ecology when we think about that is of ecology in the physical environment. Like, you know, smokestacks polluting and whales breaching the surface of the water and all this stuff, right? And yes, ecology, you know, is a term that originates from studying how physical environments sustain life. But there's an important media theorist called Neil Postman. You may be familiar with some of his work. And in the 70s, he wrote about how communication happens in something he called the semantic environment. And he said that semantic environment, much like physical environments sustain life, semantic environments sustain communication between people. And he said there are certain conditions that semantic environments must meet to be able to sustain understanding and communication between people. And he said that those conditions can become polluted, just like the physical environment can become polluted. And they become polluted when we start using words, terminology, in novel ways that are not conducive to the purpose that we want out of the environment. And to me, the prime example of that in recent times, it is what has happened to what I consider to be one of the most important words, one of the most important concepts in a democracy, which is the concept of news. News is the feedback mechanisms of a democracy. Like you can't vote, you can't have a meaningful vote if you're not informed of what you're deciding on. You know, so it's news are critical, and our notion of what news is has changed a lot in the past 10 years, and it has changed in no small part due to the fact that the word news has been co-opted for mechanisms that are designed to keep us engaged algorithmically. News used to mean what's happening now, what the latest is, right? And now it's, I'm going to show you a stream of stuff that an algorithm has determined will keep you around. That's unhealthy. And it's not just unhealthy that we're doing it. It'd be fine if we're doing it, but the fact that it's now become, that's the news, you know? That's dangerous. So we have to be mindful of the ecological impact of these things. Again, I think it's less applicable to you all because you are in a very particular space, but I think it's a broader message for those of us who deal with creating information environments. Be mindful of the distinctions you introduce and whether you are creating an environment that is healthy for the sort of interaction you want to happen there. So to summarize these three pillars, the economic, social, and ecological pillar. Now, when we think about sustainability in the physical environment, we think of things like non-renewable resources, like water and air, right? And I believe that in our field, in information, there is also a non-renewable resource that we have to be mindful of. And it's the attention of the human beings who interact with our environments. This is a precious resource. And we have to be very careful about what we do with it. Your attention now, like I can see you looking at me, like this is, to me, it's a very precious thing, what we have here. And I think we have been much too cavalier with the way that we have been designing these things. As we do so, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing with the attention of the people who are using our stuff? Are they there to become better coworkers, better parents, better citizens? Or are we keeping them there so that they can buy more stuff? I think that's an ethical question that we have to be asking ourselves. So I'm going to start winding down. I know this is heavy. It's heavy for this morning, right? Like, we haven't had breakfast. I told you it would be philosophical. But we have been thinking about what we do much too ephemerally. And we have to start thinking more about the long-term impact of the things we do. Alan Cooper talks memorably about aiming to become better ancestors. And I think that that's an important perspective to adopt, right? And especially when it comes to these contexts where we are living such important parts of our lives. So I want to invite you to ponder a few questions as you head back to work on Monday. So how would your work be different if instead of seeing yourselves as designers, developers, and managers of websites and apps, you were to see yourselves as the stewards of information environments where our neighbors are doing critical tasks, tasks that are hugely important to their lives? What would your job look like if your stakeholders and the people who fund the work you do adopted that perspective as well? And how would our society in general look? What would it look like if we were to be designing these things to foster understanding rather than for selling more stuff? As we move more and more of our social interactions and our activities to these information environments, the people who do what we do have greater agency and responsibility than ever before. Through our work, we can bring wholeness and healing to societies that are in desperate need of them. We can and must choose to do so. So thank you so much for your attention.